Good afternoon. This is Jim Landman in Kaufman Hall's Thought Leadership Group. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on ESG's growing influence in the capital markets. We will be taking questions as time permits, so please submit your questions using the webinar platform's Q&A function at any time during the hour. Today's webinar will be moderated by Lisa Goldstein, a Senior Vice President in our Treasury and Capital Markets practice and a member of our Thought Leadership team. And with that, I'll turn the webinar over to Lisa to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thanks everyone for spending your afternoon with us. I'm Lisa Goldstein, Senior Vice President in Kaufman Hall's Treasury and Capital Markets practice and Thought Leadership division. Today's webinar will focus on ESG and what investors are seeking, what ESG means to credit and the trading desk, and always a timely discussion about disclosure. Joining me today are three familiar faces and friends of Kaufman Hall: Karen Hogan, Director at BlackRock; Bob Muller, Managing Director with JP Morgan; and David Cates, Partner with Chapman & Cutler. ESG is a term that is getting more and more attention by the not-for-profit healthcare industry, by the media, and by the general consumer. So, before we dive into all of our discussion and debate and questions today, we thought it would be helpful to first define what ESG is. So, to that end, we have a slide. If Julie can put the slide up. Well, I'll talk through it. ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance, and combines everything related to all the environmental aims of environmental responsibility and stewardship, along with a just and social mission, and the governance over all of that, so E, S, and G. ESG contains many factors, but I want to leave our audience today with three key takeaways. One is ESG is not new to healthcare. Nobody should panic. It's part of the very fabric of not-for-profit healthcare. So as a matter of fact, if one were to look up social in the ESG dictionary, I believe the definition would be not-for-profit healthcare. Everything you do is for the public and the public's good health. Two, whether you realize it or not, you've probably already embarked upon your ESG strategies. Chances are pretty good that all of your strategies to date fall somewhere in the ESG rubric. And you're going to hear that word today again, rubric. ESG should be thought of as principles or a rubric. And thirdly, ESG is growing in importance for all healthcare organizations, especially given the demand for environmentally friendly strategies, preparing for weather-related changes, which is the E, certainly COVID, the aging of America, and the demand for equitable healthcare at an affordable price across the country. That's part of the S. Here we go with the slide. And then finally, G at the bottom of the slide. G speaks to the governance over both E and S, as well as all of the governance principles that not-for-profit healthcare have been talking about for years. So the factors on this slide are from a 2004 report, so already a while ago, by the United Nations on ESG, and aptly titled, the title of that report was, Who Cares Wins? So when you think about it, who embraces ESG in the long run may win, and that means the public wins as well. So at your leisure, this slide will be on our website after the call. You can review all the factors, the very broad factors. But today what we'll talk about is the application of ESG to indeed not-for-profit healthcare. So we'll take the slide down and let's start our discussion. Karen, I'd love to start with you. Karen is our veteran buy-side analyst, a familiar face and name to everyone on the call. Karen, as that buy-side analyst, when a not-for-profit healthcare organization comes to the market, primary market or maybe secondary trading, what are you looking for regarding ESG and a commitment to ESG? And what does that tell you as an investor?
Yeah, well, I guess, the very first part is if they're focused on this, it tells me they're aware. They're aware about their environment, where they live, where they serve, their workforce that they employ, and probably what investors like me are looking for when we want to lend our money. So, I mean, that's step one. And they're able to articulate it. That's something that helps me understand that there's a level of governance that cares about what's current, right? They're not just sort of blindly going through the routines of what they've always been doing. And we'll kind of get into this later, but those are the type of things that usually then tell me that they have a discipline in how they're going to be going about their business. And more likely than not, that kind of translates into better performance, operating performance, and care for the community. So that's, I think, what I hear when I hear somebody, an organization talking about ESG. They're aware and they care and they want to make sure they're doing the best that they can do. So in particular, I'm not, it has to be more than just a pretty report,
Right.
that's just out there. We want to see, what are the actions? How are you measuring them? And how do you tie that back to your operations ultimately? And then how that has impacted your financial performance. So, I mean, that's a high level kind of way of looking at it.
Karen, do you foresee a time when the metrics that you use for ESG, and we'll talk a little bit more about the metrics later, will that supplant the traditional financial metrics that the industry, has revolved around?
I don't think so. It's, maybe it's not, this direct link today where you can see like there's, better cash or reduced leverage. But the impact starts to gather steam, right? And then it's evidenced in the ratios that you see ultimately down the road. So if these organizations have been, embarking on, programs forever, right? They're probably the ones that are, more financially stable today than an organization that might not have been. So I don't see that I'm going to be not looking at days cash on hand or, cash flow ratios to debt or things along that line. That's always going to be a part of, how I look at whether I want to be lending money. So I think that it's an addition. It's not going to be supplanted.
Okay, so if you're looking at an investment and let's say the hospital does not have an ESG rubric strategy or doesn't mention it, is that a red flag for you? Will you still buy the bonds?
Yeah, well, buying bonds and not buying bonds, that's always like a tricky question, right? Because we have to be invested. So, so if there's no mention of it, I am for certain going to be asking the questions around it. Probably more likely than not, they just haven't focused on that because, there's such an array of things that you have to look at when you're coming to market, right? They want to focus on the things that are going to be the biggest interest to everybody across the board and that really tell their story. So not that this is unimportant, but there might be other issues that might have a higher priority. So it might get lost and I'm okay with that, right? But I'll ask the question and I'll hope to hear something back about what they're doing and how they're describing it, how they're monitoring it or, kind of following it through to their financials.
Got it. Okay. So let's take them one at a time. We'll start with E, environmental. Okay. Are there certain measures, or you talked about the story? What is it that you're evaluating or looking to evaluate for E?
Yeah. So here it's mostly those physical risk metrics, I would say. We at BlackRock partner with Rhodium for scoring climate risk. Or the climate aspects, and their locational specific type risks, whether it's, droughts or wildfires, floods, earthquakes, things along that line. We're looking for resiliency, right? So, the one that kind of always sticks out in my head is, you take hurricanes, for example, right? And I think it was, in the Houston area a long time ago, Hurricane Allison, I think it was initially.
Yeah, 2001.
Totally devastated that area. And that storm really shaped how hospitals evaluated their building layouts, construction, maintenance, everything across the board. And I believe that, it's the Texas Medical Center that built these gateways so that they could close them off when there was a hurricane coming and they protected the whole, community of healthcare. And that really helped out I think, the following storms that came through that were, very devastating across the region didn't impact those hospitals. So that's the kind of thing that, it wasn't called ESG then, but that's the type of thing that when you invest in, looking at things that are affecting you environmentally, that it matters financially down the road. They didn't have to shut their doors. They didn't have to postpone surgeries. They could, be available to continue to operate. And I think that came, again, very important during COVID, right? Organizations that had resiliency plans were, better situated than those that didn't.
Right. So the return is almost the absence of a disaster because you're prepared for it, unlike Tropical Storm Allison, perhaps.
Yeah, because you can't move out of where you operate, right? That's you
Right.
work where, right? You can't change, where you have your manufacturing plant. It's the hospital. So
Right. So you mentioned COVID, and that one may say would fall into the social risks, a healthcare crisis of the public. So social to me is perhaps one of the hardest to kind of wrap your head around because it's such a broad category. So maybe tell our guests today, how you measure social, what initial metrics are you looking at, and what may one expect to see short-term, long-term from a socially oriented mission?
yeah, that's a lot to unpack.
Take your time.
Yep. So I think that so COVID, I think it was a lot of different things, right? It's being able to be resilient, and it's also thinking about the community where you're serving. So the social aspects, I think, are very important. The way we kind of look for this at BlackRock, we have a social opportunity model that developed to quantitatively score. So that we screen and look, we sort of identify undercapitalized areas, and we look to equally weight those on a county level scoring model. And I guess the pillars of that are like, racial equity, community, employment, physical health, mental health, housing, and then justice metrics. And they're all publicly available type measures that we go out there. I think there's like 31 of them that are public and 6 that we developed internally. But that all comes together to be a score. Perhaps the flaw in this, if there is one, but I'll just be straight about it. I think that it's complicated with hospitals, right? Because they're not just located in one area. And a great example, I think, of this is, when I think about LA County, right? So if you get a score for LA County, neighborhoods in LA are very different from each other. So if you have a hospital located in one of those neighborhoods, it might have a totally different color from these perspectives than it would if you were in a different neighborhood, but in the same county, which has, like, is it dark green, light green, light red, dark red, as you move across the scale. So there's a little bit of, a nuance here that I think is going to have to sort of over time be developed a little bit better. But, we're being part of the discussion, right? We're coming up with ways to think about this, and it's going to evolve over time. So I can explain those, and we can leave it there.
Okay. We could go all night on these, but let me ask you one more question, then we'll turn to Bob. The last one, G, governance. The not-for-profit industry, better and better about governance. Is there something specifically that you seek regarding governance over E and S, or governance in general, right, of not-for-profit healthcare?
I think, governance is probably the one thing that we've always thought about in our, concerns about credits, right? So I want to know how the board's involved. I want to know what senior leadership is doing with their employment community. How are they interacting with the region that they're serving? So this is probably the most kind of connected to how we do analysis generally. But maybe a little more specific, I talked about being aware, right? Setting goals, identifying ways to measure this, reassessing, over time, and keep pushing forward, finding ways to, basically improve quality of care, and then circling back to the financial results that allow you to kind of have this ongoing, kind of investment into the system and keep on strategy type thing. you know, there's a great example out there. It's an urban, not an urban, it's a safety net hospital, I guess it is in an urban kind of setting that was, you know, it was a non-investment grade credit. It was an academic medical center, you know, had like 30% of its payers were Medicaid or not paying. Just a terrible, you know, kind of payer mix. You know, but they did a lot of these kind of things 4 or 5 years ago. And they, you know, they said, you know, this is going to be an investment. We got to put the money to work. And it's not going to be pretty for a while, but the leadership team, the C-suite, they tied their compensation to these metrics. So they put their, you know, money behind, you know, what they were trying to achieve. And just recently, and I don't know, they may even be on this call, but they came to market. They're an investment grade credit. They have, you know, a very, you know, solid balance sheet, which is going to allow them to continue to serve that community that really needs them there. And they found a way to do this in a way that's going to be cash flow positive and doing all the things that they need to be doing. So those are the kind of stories that when you have the right governance and you put that together with these kind of actions, you really get a great investment. And that's where I want to put my money. I'm willing to wait 5 years. I'm willing to wait, you know, until this kind of comes to fruition, as long as there's commitment with it.
Well, that establishes the business case for great governance, right? What you just described.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. Bob, let's turn to you. Bob Mueller, Managing Director, JP Morgan, and of course, Oracle of all things credit. Welcome today, Bob. Would love to get your perspective from the sell side, from the trading desk. How should ESG inform or influence credit, big credit? Your thoughts?
Good. So the first answer to that is not so much so far. And I think Karen hinted, actually, her last example was a really good example because it's one of the few where I can not specifically know a name, where you've heard that their actions in this world led to a better credit rating. But by and large, I haven't seen much impact in the short term. And again, there is some long history here. Remember, the environmental piece of ESG has impacted ratings on and off for a long time. I go back and remember I worked a lot in Louisiana after Katrina hit. I worked with the state. I particularly worked with the city of New Orleans and other credits down there. And the Katrina event had an enormous impact on their credit. And when Karen talks about resiliency, they built resiliency after the fact. It's made a big difference since then. But at the time, it really almost took their credit down. So we've seen those specific examples. We can think of Sisters of Mercy with Joplin, Missouri, where their hospital was completely destroyed. It took 2 years to get FEMA reimbursement. Again, nonprofit hospitals ultimately are treated like governments. But again, there was a long gap. So that part of the credit equation, I think, has been there for a long time. The piece that's getting harder, and I think we're hearing it a little bit in the corporate world, is, well, what is the long-term impact of climate change going to be on your credit quality? And again, I've done a lot of work personally in kind of the world of state insurance, hurricane insurance agencies. And the reality is, we don't know the answer to that yet. So far, people who live on the coast have had a federal government put. People who live in floodplains have had a federal government put. Increasingly, our coastal areas are inhabited by higher income people, and you replace bungalows with larger houses, and then you get a hurricane, and the federal government comes in and replenishes the beaches and basically provides protection. One of the long-term answers that we do not have is, does the protections being provided begin to fall away? And if the result of climate change is that we begin to find that people are more on their own, that the federal flood program begins to finally charge people what it's supposed to charge, and insurance companies feel differently about wildfire risk, that becomes a really important question. And that environmental piece, I think, becomes the longer term question about credit quality. And the first entities that we see that begin to say that's important and meaningful, and we're scoring that climate risk in a different way, I think it filters back into kind of the whole world. And hospitals, you know, they're a sub-piece. Tornadoes tend to be one-off, but the larger climate risk of floods and hurricanes and wildfires, think they tend to be more of a general type of issue. The S I have not seen as a credit factor at all so far. It may very well come in more politically than otherwise. And the G, I think we periodically have seen it. And I think about South Broward Hospital District, which had being a governmental hospital, had a significant political scandal. And recently, they got a better opinion because of the resolution in terms of what governance meant. So again, a sub-piece, but I think going forward is going to be all pulled under the single rubric of ESG. Anyway.
Right. Bob, you attend many hospital and health system board meeting. Are boards talking about this? Is this a special agenda item or now a permanent agenda item? What's the chatter?
Yeah. Like everything on ESG, it's all over the place, but I think it's beginning to work in. And interestingly, two places that we're seeing this come in very visibly is with CIOs. And very much the question is becoming within their own investment portfolio. You think about the size of some of these investment portfolios out there. The question that's almost the beginning question is, what are we doing with regards to our investment portfolio? And are we investing according to ESG? And in turn, and we've been getting reverse inquiries on this very specific topic. In turn, that then filters back to the board and gets to the question of ESG with regards to investment practices. We're also seeing it to some extent on outreach because of investors. And so they're getting a lot more queries at the hospitals with regards to what are they doing on ESG. That filters back up to the board. And the third place we certainly see among some hospitals that they really are actively engaged in the concept of ESG. And they're focused not just on sustainability and climate risk, but and we saw this at the Morgan Healthcare Conference this year, there are people who are actively focusing on the ESG piece and are spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to transform their institutions from what they have been, which is community benefit driven, ones in which they really are making a social impact and they're dealing with the determinants of healthcare and all those things. But it is a hit or miss. And as Karen would say, and I think David would say, disclosure on those topics is all over the place.
Right, and we're going to talk about the always timely issue of disclosure. But before we do, Bob, let me pick up on one of the threads. You mentioned we may be seeing a difference. So what is happening in Europe with ESG? And related, when our not-for-profit hospital and healthcare clients issue taxable debt, could there be an interplay as to what's happening in Europe coming soon to a theater near you? Go ahead.
That's obviously, that's the sweet spot of what we do. It's a question we get asked often. It's now, Europe is definitely way ahead of us. There is a uniform regulatory regime. Europe has basically given insurance companies credit with regards to their capital for social investing in ESG. When you start having it turn into money, they're much more willing to invest. There's a sizable portion of European funds that invest on ESG basis. Again, it's not, in some cases, it's leased buildings, it's different things in different places, but they're far ahead of us. And I think part of the reason for that is that Europe is a very different place than the United States. It's pretty well uniform. There's not as much bandwidth with regards to what we regard as climate change risk and social risk. I think there's a lot of reasons that Europe has been out in front of it, but certainly the regulatory environment has encouraged it. What does that translate into? If you sell an index taxable make-whole call, you have to put it in there that looks like what they used to buy. The benefit is 2 to 5 basis points. It's meaningful. Some of our people would actually say it can be 5 to 10 basis points at a time. That, if you're an issuer and you can sell in those kind of pieces, European market is very focused on ESG and willing to pay for it. The answer on the tax exempt side, Lisa, has been, well, there are people who are talking about it like the weather, but they haven't really yet put their money where their mouth is. And so the historic answer last year and before was, well, they help us a little bit because the orders tend to stay in and they tend to be sticky if we bump the price, and that's helpful to you as an issuer. What we're now willing to say, and my underwriting desk actually, I talked to this morning, they said they're actually willing to put a basis point spread now that even the tax exempt market in part because of Europe, but in part because of people like BlackRock and others that are beginning to have a much bigger focus on ESG. We're now seeing an impact of 0 to 3 basis points. So when we have current situation that we got to buy, it might be 0. But if they don't have to buy, it could be a 2 or 3 basis point value. That's an absolute definite change, Lisa, from anything we would have said a year or 2 ago.
Wow.
So it's filtering in here. And I think the more it filters in, the more it's going to ripple back into the marketplace.
Got it. Okay. And we've seen just a handful of not-for-profit health systems issue something called green bonds, where they're labeled green bonds, the proceeds of which are approved, if you will, or verified to be environmentally focused. Are you seeing, and there's only been, maybe half a dozen. So is there, dare I say it, a greenium for green bonds? And I don't think we've seen social bonds in not-for-profit healthcare. Any of those that might be on the horizon?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we've seen a few more green bonds. We certainly talk to our clients about trying to get designation and certifying leads, buildings, and things like that. And again, one of the things we may talk about later is, again, do third-party certifiers help you in this process instead of just your own certifications, and what does that mean? And we can talk about that later. But the reality is that if you look at Kaiser, and I'll use Kaiser as an example here, Kaiser has said that they're going to be carbon neutral. In fact, Kaiser doesn't say they will be, they say they are carbon neutral. If you go to our trading desk and say, does that make a difference? The first thing they jump upon is Kaiser and being carbon neutral. And that they would say that most of their bonds are held by socially ESG-oriented investors. So if you look at a name like Kaiser and you look at the fact that they are expanding their base, they've attracted this core type of buyers, you have to believe that's going to pull along other people, particularly if we have savings. We get a lot more green bonds than we've seen. On social bonds, I haven't seen it. We get them in low-income housing. It's really easy to call a low-income housing project a social bond. In healthcare, as we'll talk later, and even as you said, healthcare is certainly of high social purpose, but that can be defined in different ways. And I think it may be a little more challenging to call hospitals social bonds to get people quite to jump on that bandwagon who are really oriented towards social bond investing. I think green bonds are easier.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. They're certainly easier to kind of wrap your head around than, again, social being such a broad definition, and what isn't social, if you will. Well, Bob, we're going to come back to some of those thoughts. Let me now turn to David Cates, partner at Chapman Cutler, a familiar face to many. Frequently you serve as underwriters disclosure counsel. So the D word, disclosure. David, talk to us about what, as we chatted before, what is required, say, in an offering memorandum regarding ESG, and then we'll talk about part 2, what isn't required, but what are you advising and seeing?
Sure, it's actually an interesting question, Lisa, because when we go out and do a bond offering, you have your federal securities law requirements, right? You cannot omit things. You have to, all your disclosure has to be accurate. And I think we can all agree that, and in fact, I think you said it, Lisa, before, health systems actually are ESG entities as a whole. And so a number of the things that we would typically associate with the E and the S and even the G are already in your Appendix A's and have been for, in some cases, decades. For example, environmental risk sections, we have that separately. It's not an ESG section. It's a required disclosure, especially if you live in somewhere like California or Florida, and that's your community. You need to disclose those risks, and you need to disclose what you're doing about them, or you're potentially omitting a material fact. And some, as Karen mentioned before, that's a real issue in your disclosure, and it can lead to liability if you're not careful as well. Cybersecurity is a newer one, but we have a separate cybersecurity section and have before ESG became a thing. you know, another example, getting to governance even, when Sarbanes-Oxley came into being, we had to now describe our audit committee and let the investors know exactly who's on the audit committee out of your board of directors. They're supposed to be tagged. So I would argue and say that, you know, the ESG disclosure has been around forever with regard to hospitals, because they are that kind of an entity and have all that, a lot of that disclosure in already. So what does that mean at the end of the day when you're putting together your disclosure? Because, and I don't know if we have investment bankers on, luckily there's, I know Bob's on the credit side, so I'll be careful how I say it, but you know, everyone wants an ESG section in your offering document, in part so, you know, people can look at that and say, oh yes, this is an ESG oriented entity. And so we have started creating an ESG section and describing some of the things that maybe are outside of what we ordinarily would consider our disclosure requirements. You know, a lot of that, as I've seen it put together, is important. It's good stuff that the hospital is doing. It might be described a little bit elsewhere. It's added to here. We add some things socially in particular that the health system is doing, and we add, you know, we check the box and we include a little more information around ESG. But a lot of it's frankly already in there. And when you're adding an ESG section, I think the key is just, you know, we need to be very careful with what we describe and how we describe it. You need to be truthful. It has to be real, and it needs to be information that's not, you know, you don't omit anything as you're doing it, and you don't puff yourself up too much as well in terms of what you're doing. It has to be accurate. You know, as Bob said, we're starting to see, and we'll talk about this more in detail later, but we're starting to see actual real savings to having an ESG designation or an ESG section or description. And if that's the case, and you're not really doing this, well, you know, if it comes back and the value of your bonds change, that may be a real problem for you. So you need to be really careful with what you write and how you write it. We are seeing ESG sections, I think even Bob mentioned this, that are all over the board. There's no standard here, but at this point, you know, it really does mean different things to different borrowers, and we've been including the section pretty routinely for a while now, so that people can understand the elements around what a hospital or health system is doing.
So it sounds like you've got to be truthful, of course, like you said, but your statements in an ESG disclosure section, I mean, do they have to be factable, quantifiable, metric driven, right? We're dedicated to DE&I. Well, do you have to back that with a metric? And how does that happen, since we're very much in the nascent stages of all this? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the key thing you're asking really is, you know, how do we ensure that this disclosure is accurate, consistent, and what the industry is really looking for. And I do think, you know, and there's a couple things here, right? Number one, as Bob mentioned, we've done some green bonds. I've worked on some, and there's different elements when you're actually going to get the ESG designation, like green bond. I haven't really seen any social impact bonds at this point in the healthcare space, but if you want that designation, there are ways and industry providers that can actually outline what you should do to be a green bond, or what you should do to be a social impact bond. For example, there's the International Capital Markets Association, and they have their 4 core principles. How are you going to use the proceeds, right? You know, what are the projects going to be focused on? So you can relate some of these principles to your ESG disclosure, right? What's the process for your project selection and evaluation? How do you manage the proceeds, or how do you manage your ESG programs? What are you reporting on? Right? What going forward are you going to say about ESG, and how is that all going to work with your continued disclosure and the things that you report to the market? I think if you sort of follow those, they call them green bond principles at the ICMA. They also have their social bond principles, which basically say the same thing.
Right.
you follow those, you're going to probably have some pretty good consistent disclosure. If you really want to get into it, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board has 77 industry-specific principles that you can work through and try to work in some of those or all of those if you want into your ESG disclosure. So there are resources out there, but none of them are required. None of them are consistently used, frankly, in my experience. But they're a good starting point, at least as you're trying to craft your disclosure and stay on point and do it in the right way.
And once you develop your ESG section in your offering memorandum, what does that mean? Does that mean you're committing to something on an annual basis regarding these same principles or disclosure, or is that voluntary?
It depends how you phrase it. It can be voluntary. It is not one of the things, for example, that 15C212 requires you to continue reporting on. It's not a listed event. It's not a real financial metric for the most part when it comes to the way they define financial information. So as long as you don't commit to ongoing disclosure, it would be voluntary if you wanted to do so. If you commit to it in your offering document, I think you can make the argument that it either becomes no longer voluntary or the investment community is going to expect it, and you should probably consider it not voluntary. If you then do so then that's your offering document. If you then do consistently report on your ESG progress and initiatives, you may create your own duty to update that kind of disclosure, because as with anything, once you begin to report on something, you do need to consider the impacts going forward, because if that changes and you don't inform the investment community, then you're omitting something, and that can come back to haunt you if that negatively impacts your bonds and the pricing of your bonds down the road.
Right, and these are typically 30-year obligations, so know what you're committing to. And I think, as these metrics, some are established, but some are evolving. So a metric today that measures, social impact may look very different, like you said, say 5 years from now. So you have to be ready to alert your investors, right, that the metric has changed, the standard has changed. Very different, say, if you would agree with this, the accounting standards are set, right? Everybody, follows the accounting rules, and from there, financial metrics can be calculated. This is, again, maybe E stands for evolving when it comes to disclosure and metrics. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's all accurate, Lisa. That is what makes this disclosure so difficult, is there really are, I mentioned there are some, principles and standards that you can look to, but those really are not industry-wide, and you're pulling from other industries. Those are more corporate related than not-for-profit healthcare. And, this is an evolving industry, and things are going to change. What is important to people is going to change. What's important to a hospital or health system is going to change. And you need to, in doing this disclosure, you need to account for that and make sure that that is a part of the disclosure and a part of your considerations about what you say and, frankly, what you commit to down the road, because we really don't have uniformity anywhere, in my experience, in not only the disclosure, but how people handle the disclosure after the bond issue and things of that nature. It's a very, it's kind of like the wild, wild west at this point a little bit. And I think it would be nice to get some guidance. The MSRB, went out and tried to get some input on some things. And frankly, that was, that comment period closed last month, and a lot of the commentary that they got was, the MSRB doesn't have authority to do this in the first place, and so you got to stop, and this is more for the SEC or someone of that, some entity of that nature. So I don't think at this point, there's not a lot of leadership, and there's not a lot of information that we have to help guide us, and it really is evolving, and we'll learn more as time goes on. But that does really, as a lawyer, right, I'm very cautious, and I'm worried about the disclosure and the risks involved in the disclosure. I think that means when you're a health system, you have to be very, very careful about what you say here and what you do and what you commit to, because if you do, right, step in something the wrong way and it all comes back to haunt you, you're going to regret doing something that wasn't really carefully thought out. Not that we don't carefully think out every element of our Appendix A, but this has become a little bit you know, a little bit different in the regard, in the sense that we don't have good standards to follow. We know how to disclose our board section. We know how and what's important when it comes to cybersecurity and some of the other things I mentioned. But this is a really different animal at this point, and caution is really important, I think.
And you mentioned cyber, so let's spend a few minutes on that. I think some folks think cyber is not part of ESG. Others would say, of course it is. Putting that aside, what are the rules or guidelines regarding cyber disclosure, cyber preparedness, you know, events that have occurred or attempts on cyber issues? You know, what is out there that's required to be disclosed by not-for-profit healthcare?
Yeah, I think at this stage of the game, we can all agree that cybersecurity is very important, and the information around what you're doing from a cybersecurity standpoint. How are you protecting yourself? What is your experience with cybersecurity? Do you have violations? Do you have risk if you did have some security breaches and now you maybe are being sued, or you have the potential to be sued down the road because recently, you know, you lost all of your or some of your protected health information. There's a lot that really, in general, for any entity that's accessing the public market, cybersecurity is important. I think it's even more so for a health system because you do have very sensitive information and a lot of additional risks around the potential, you know, breaches of your cybersecurity, and then you know, the disclosure of that information outside of your health system. And so I do think from my standpoint, and this is the advice that I give when I'm doing a bond issue, I think it is a mandatory section to have in an offering document what, you know, called cybersecurity. What are you doing around it? What's your experience? Do you have any risks? And that sort of thing. Especially if you've had a breach, then you really do need to consider what to say and what kind of material liabilities and risks you have that you need to let a bondholder know about when you're issuing the bonds, because that would be a material omission if you had something like that.
David, would you say most of your clients have purchased cyber insurance? I don't know if you get into that granular level or not yet.
We certainly do from a due diligence standpoint. We look into that and make sure that that is, you know, see what they're doing and then just try to figure out if we need to disclose something or not. The policies aren't always disclosed, at least not, you know, fulsome. I mean, you know, hospitals don't often like to give their, okay, here's how much money, you know, here's our policy and here's how large it is and that sort of thing.
Right.
But the existence of one is often disclosed, sometimes not. It just depends on experience and how you're framing and laying out the disclosure. But it's something that we definitely diligence, and if it's something that should be disclosed or discussed, either because there's deficiencies or you know, the hospital wants to tout it, for example, then we will often include it.
Okay. Karen, let me ask you on cyber. What is it you want to see in this regard? Everything that David mentioned, plus?
No, I think, you know, he's hitting on the points, right? I mean, knowing that the board's engaged on this, that's in that section. I'm looking for this, like, you know, do they have a special committee set up for it? How are they approaching testing, right? Do they have a particular person in the leadership role? You know, and then if they have a plan, right? And maybe it doesn't have to be in the disclosure, but at least I would like to be able to like hear that verbally, you know, in some of the investor updates. It's kind of curious though, because, you know, you talk about standards, right? And what has to get put into disclosure and what isn't. So is there a particular standard like that was set out, and like who set out, you know, what you have to put in for cyber? Because I'm kind of curious, is it just sort of evolved over time what we put in there, or is there something specific that, you know, is sort of written in the securities laws that say you have to now report on this? Is it related to HIPAA?
I mean, it's not specific in the sense that there's a set of criteria or things that you need to include, but when you're considering, and frankly, every section this is true for, you know, you can't make any material misrepresentations and you can't omit anything that's material. And so when you're drafting your cybersecurity section, you need to think about all of that in the context of what you're disclosing. It is, we think, in a lot of cases, material to investors that there's a policy that the board's engaged, and we need to therefore we need to describe that. If you've had a breach and you're being sued for tens of millions of dollars, omitting that is a material, right, issue and omission. And so, right, I mean, you need to just think about the context of the facts at hand and how this all applies under the really the anti-fraud standards, because that's really the goal at the end of the day, is to make sure you are protected from that, from anything, any misrepresentations or omissions that are material.
Yeah, and the reason I ask it is because you're saying, what do I as an investor want to see? It's really different from, one document to another. So from one law firm to another, I don't see that there's any, obviously if there's a financial impact, with a lawsuit, those always kind of get told out there, but there, the rest of it is just, it seems to be, it just varies. So, but.
Yeah, I think to a degree that may be intentional, right? Because every system, every hospital is handling cybersecurity differently, and they need to describe to you what they're doing. And so what is material and how to lay it out, probably from hospital to hospital, is very different. And that probably is some of the reason you're seeing differences, not just law firm to law firm, but really it's the facts on the ground, and what we're trying to describe is the most important part of that disclosure.
Yeah, right, yep.
Bob, you have thoughts on cyber? Bob, you may be on mute.
There we go. Sorry, your organizer muted me, so it took a little while to unmute it.
That's okay.
I think most of this has been said, just kind of two summation comments. One, when you ask what boards focus on in ESG, cyber absolutely falls under governance. And it, as Karen said, boards are focused, at least a lot of boards are focused on cyber. And it says a lot about your governance practices. It's a very clear risk. We've seen it happen. We certainly have had heightened concerns with the war in the Ukraine that we're going to have some attacks on the healthcare system. So it's out there, and it's a big topic. The second thing I think we can say about cyber is that it is a hot button topic right now, and all of the ESG things that we talk about, it's one of the 2 or 3 topics that we keep getting asked about. We keep telling our clients that you have to focus on cybersecurity. You have to discuss it in rating presentations and in investor meetings. And if not, you're going to be asked about it. And if you get asked about it and it's not properly covered, then we can't really talk about it to investors. So it's a topic. I would certainly put that in the top 2 or 3 buzzwords right now for disclosure.
But Bob, how you said that, it almost suggests that boards of not-for-profit hospitals, they're not thinking about cyber, or they haven't crystallized their strategies around it to present it. Is that what we're hearing, or no?
It would seem to be that if I was on the investor rating agency side and I'm asking, what is your policies and what have you done with regards to cyber? It really says an awful lot about governance, because everybody out there is affected. Yeah. We have certainly enormous focus on protection of medical records and HIPAA and everything, and yet we have a way here for going around that. And so it should be front and center with regards to governance.
Got it. Okay. I think we have a question that's come in. Let me turn to Jim, the voice from above. Do you want to ask the question, Jim?
Yes, and Karen, this question was on the BlackRock social opportunity model that you described. And the question is how you evaluate or score factors such as community health or racial equity, which may not be in the control of the hospital.
That's why it's a model, right? And it has a multitude of factors. Like I said, there were 31 publicly sourced metrics. So you're basically, it's within your community that you have to, it is what it is. You just can't ignore that. I know we hear a lot recently over the last couple of days, Lowen Institute and how they're, sort of maybe a little bit harsher on organizations that are in weaker communities. That it's just sort of part of the package of what you have, right? So just because you might score lower on one of these kind of factors doesn't mean that you're not investable, right? It just means where you fall within the spectrum. So in reality, I think credits that probably are in lower ranges of that, right? Because of just where they're located, we're probably going to be more interested in helping them and lending them money and investing in them as a social investment. Those are the kind of credits that we actually probably end up, leaning into a little bit more heavily. If that answers the question, I don't know.
You know, Bob, I think you had mentioned community benefit. So I think the industry would say, you know, for years we have provided annual community benefit. We do it because it's the right thing to do. We do it to justify our tax exempt status. Isn't that enough? You know, look at all the charity care and free care in so many ways that we give. Why do we have to ramp up under something called ESG? What is different now and why if we're already doing it? So, Bob, thoughts on that?
Right. Well, Karen hinted at that new study that just came out, and that's another one of the periodic broadsides that come off against tax exemption. Again, nonprofit hospitals serve a real purpose, and they provide real good. The question is whether the old metrics are going to be the way in which they're going to be evaluated going forward, including, I guess, even as this study shows on tax exemption. So it's going to have to be thought about, and it's going to have to be thought about in a more active way. And I'm not convinced that statements about how much you do for Medicare and Medicaid actually going to go that far in the world of ESG, and particularly if it begins to become more emphasis on the S piece of ESG in this process. And if you think about Tenet and HCA also do a lot of Medicare and Medicaid, and therefore they're, under that definition, doing a lot of community benefit for their tax-paying institutions, without a doubt. So I think this is one we're going to hear more about. I think it depends upon where the political environment in this country goes, as much as anything. But if we begin to certainly have more of a focus on social benefit, it's going to become a topic for hospitals. And when you get the social bonds, I think if you get them, one of the topics that comes up is affordability. And community benefit has no comment with regards to affordability. Affordability falls very much under the macro rubric of how much does U.S. healthcare cost. So there's a lot of subtopics. I'm not going to go further into that, but it's I think, without question, Lisa.
Got it. Okay. Okay. So if I made the statement to Bob, Karen, David, if I made the statement that ESG is here to stay, would you agree with that if we're facing, say, you know, another healthcare crisis or COVID, the next wave, or a recession, or, you know, a Balanced Budget Act Part 2? Does ESG continue to be a main strategy for not-for-profit healthcare? Anybody disagree with that statement? Anybody want to respond to that in any way?
It's here to stay. I think so. I mean, it's like we've talked about. It's a further way of defining the true use of what hospitals mean in their communities. So yeah, right. I think it's here to stay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think a little bit is how you define that, but as I was trying to make the point before, I think it's been here, right? Most of these aspects are not really new, and it's just how we are thinking about them and how we're now trying to disclose them that's new. And I think that's definitely here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future, and probably there'll be an increasing focus on it, I would think, because we're probably going to get smarter about how we disclose all of this and the way in which we disclose it, rather than just having, you know, an ESG section. There's probably going to be a lot more thought around, okay, do we want some sort of ESG designation besides a green bond or a social bond, and what will happen with all of that? It should be very interesting, I would think, going forward.
And how we disclose it will be part of function of how we measure it. Go ahead, Bob.
I was just going to say, Lisa, that again, back to the backdrop of the U.S. When you look at the response to the MSRB commentary, there was a very definite response from almost half the states with regards to having the MSRB keep its nose out of the process of what states do. And ultimately, in some ways or another, states drive disclosure in the media business. They always have. So I think political backdrop does matter. And to the extent that political backdrop is offset by what investors and people putting money into BlackRock and all those people say, I think you begin to get a push and pull with that if you get a different regime in Washington. So
yeah,
it's part of this still political.
The one thing I kind of, because I agree political environment does matter here, but I think about, you know, the ACA, right? and how horrible that was, right? Everybody thought it was going to be so bad, right? And he's like, and then the whole political, like, we're going to, reform it and replace it or whatever we're going to do. And as soon as you start talking about taking something away, that's when you realize how much people really need it, right? Or they want it, or it matters. And I think some of this social stuff we're talking about with healthcare has really just shown a light on the inequities that are out there, right? And people have a voice now that maybe they didn't feel like they really had. And so even if there is a shift in the political ways of this, I don't think this can be put back under, the rug. I think it's something that has to be addressed, and it's something that should be addressed.
And Karen, do you think it was this national coast to coast, if not global pandemic that just brought this, and events of, horrible events of 2020 that brought this to the forefront? Because we know, and our audience know, that healthcare inequities, affordability, this is not new.
No, it's not. But I think the pandemic was something, it showed how vital these entities are in our communities. And if you don't have them, how the impact can be just detrimental, right? You talk about who died from this, virus, and who didn't, what communities were mostly impacted, what racial groups were mostly impacted. When you even talk about people, it's, like the daily workers, right? Not the salaried workers who could sit at home and, do their work from home and do their WebExes like we're doing, right? And the ones who had to actually still keep going out there and be in the environment kind of working, they're at a disadvantage. And I think those things just don't go back, hidden. The pandemic was a big catalyst. Maybe not the only one, but I think it was a big catalyst.
Okay. And I think we saw many hospitals really expand beyond their four walls and offer services to their local community, maybe never before. Childcare, housing, affordable housing, even, for their employees, food banks, right? All the things that come under social mission or good governance to make the right decisions for the community. The financial benefits may be short-term, or as you talked about, Karen and David and Bob, longer term, but it certainly built goodwill, if anything, with the community. So,
and the one thing about how you talk about going out into the communities, right, and making sure the where to care kind of thing is happening in the right place. I think they found that, the emergency rooms that might have been used for primary care type services, but were, the expense of handling that in an emergency room as opposed to an outpatient, a primary care doctor's office is dramatically different. And so when those people didn't come back to the emergency rooms, it was kind of a good thing, right? Because now they were getting cared for in the right setting, right? They were getting the right cost associated with it. So it was more affordable for the people who had to get the care as well as the hospital. So those are the type of things that I think kind of also shone a light to the hospitals, not just the people out in the community, but to the hospitals about how we should be looking at social as we, consider, operating a hospital.
Right. And that sounds, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, Karen, I think you hit the nail on the head with regard to the pandemic accelerating some of this, because at least in my experience, a number of hospitals were already thinking about the social aspect of it, or the social impact that they can have, and right, is there a way to finance that creatively? We had seen social impact bonds in other areas of the country and the economy, and healthcare seemed to be, really ripe for that sort of thing. And how could you apply that, right? Sort of a, we haven't even talked about the metric-driven social impact bonds that are a part of the whole ESG conversation. And I think hospitals were struggling a little bit before the pandemic to figure out how can we work that? How can we, realize the savings of keeping people out of our ERs and pass that along to maybe investors who invested in that kind of a bond, which was a win-win for us, for them, for the country as a whole, for people coming and trying to afford healthcare. And it seems to me that there's a lot more thinking around it now because of the pandemic, because ESG has become so popular and such a big thing, that I think we might start seeing social bonds, perhaps social impact type bonds, in the healthcare space as people get more creative and think more about it because of the pandemic and all the other things you mentioned, Karen. So it's been a fascinating conversation, at least from a legal side. As I've been involved in some of that, I really think that is something that the pandemic's accelerated and is probably coming.
Yeah, and there's a lot of private investment too. So, like hospitals that say they want to affordable housing for their staffing or whatever, whether it was from nursing or whatever. There's private money out there that's financing that. So it doesn't have to all be in the public, tax exempt market or even taxable bonds. So there are ways that there's investment being had here.
Well, it sounds like a very good story to tell, David, in disclosure documents. Bob, it sounds like a very good story to sell on the desk. Karen, it sounds like a wonderful story to invest in. So I think we've got it all covered. I'm cognizant of time. We don't want to overstay our welcome. I've got 5 devices in front of me telling me it's time to wrap up. That's probably not very green, but it works. So let me thank Bob, Karen, and David for a wonderful discussion. Thank our audience as well. We want to wish everybody, for those who celebrate, happy holidays and perhaps a very green spring for everyone as well. So thank you, and we'll talk with everyone very soon.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Bye.
Thank you.